Everybody. So recently, the issue of George Floyd's death as a result of his being arrested by 4 police officers, including Derek Chauvin, putting a knee on his neck, where it's found guilty and in some senses confessed possibly to murder. That has been raised again by a number of commentators, including Ben Shapiro. Now, I haven't commented publicly about this. I'm not American. I don't know the intricacies of US law. I know that most of US law is reasonably similar to Australian law because it is sort of based on English law, English common law, which goes back 600 years or so. But in the past 600 years, it's deviated quite a lot. English law's a fair bit different to Australian law, and American law is quite different again. So there are certain aspects of US law that are really very different. And of course in USA it varies state to state and sometimes even county to county and so forth. So the question then is, what are they doing there? Is it relevant? Is it correct? So the first thing I'd note is that Nate the lawyer has suggested that it's actually completely false because he confessed at least to, in one court, Derek Chauvin confessed to the murder, agreed that it was murder, and he was also found guilty in the jury trial to another aspect of it. He confessed to one aspect of it, so therefore it can't completely be appealed, only the bit which had the jury can be, and it's not really appealable. They are trying to appeal, but so far every type of appeal has failed. So I'm going to trust Nate the lawyer on that. He seems to be fairly neutral. Sometimes he'll support left-sided arguments, sometimes he'll support right-sided arguments, and so forth. So he seems to be a reasonably neutral commentator on this, a reasonably accurate commentator, and he knows a lot more about US law than I do. So I'll trust him when he says it was a fair judgment per US law. But I then thought, let's look at it from Australian law. Let's imagine that or something essentially the same happened in Australian law. And let's imagine all the other circumstances are the same. So he was black, the arresting officer was white, the other 3 officers were of other races that weren't white. One was black, one was Asian, and one was mixed race. Well, imagine all that. Well, imagine that there was a public outcry about it, and so forth. And the funny thing is, that's kind of already happened in Australia. There's been numerous examples where, Aboriginal, because we don't really have African Americans in Australia. We sort of technically do, but it's such a tiny amount that it doesn't really matter. Yes, we do have Africans who were born in Africa that come in as immigrants. We have a Sudanese population, still fairly small. And culturally they're very, very different to African Americans. They don't have the slavery thing. They instead are coming from war-torn countries, and they were born in those countries. They haven't been in Australia for 500 years or however long it is. They don't have that whole idea that slavery is a racist thing. Nothing like that. And it's still a fairly small proportion, but the Aboriginals do in some cultural ways mirror the African Americans. Aboriginals are technically more like the Native Americans, because they're the native people. They don't like to be called that, indigenous people. But in some cultural ways they're more like the African Americans. So we have certainly had cases where Aboriginal Australians were, in the process of being arrested, were shot and killed. That has happened in Australia. And I can tell you that the result has never been that the arresting officers went to jail for 40 years, or some people have said it's only really 22 years and whatever. They haven't gone to jail at all. Now, they've all been slightly different. But there have been cases where there has been massive riots, protests and all that. They still didn't go to jail. They still weren't arrested. And there have been times when it was videotaped, or parts of it were videotaped. Now, not exactly the same, but close enough. And indeed, I have to just remind people here that analysis has proven that even under US law, if there was no videotape of it, well, not by members of the public, none of those officers would have been arrested. It would have been handled purely by an internal police investigation. The only reason that they were even considered for being arrested was because of not only the videotape, but the public outcry, the riots. So there could have been the videotape but no riots, would still not have been arrested. So it's only because of the level of the riots, because there were people destroying shops and all that and claiming it was racism when it wasn't. It wasn't racism, by the way. And I can say that definitively, because if there was any possibility it was racism, the prosecution would have argued that, and they didn't. They didn't mention it. It's not only that he wasn't found guilty of racism, but it wasn't even charged with anything. And it is possible under US law to charge someone with racism. He wasn't. And none of them were. I mean, it'd be a bit silly too when one of the arresting officers was black, and they all participated in it. So the whole reason for the outcry was the racism aspect of it, and that was dishonest. That was a complete lie. They made that up. So in other words, had they known that it was not a racist attack, there wouldn't have been a riot. And had there not been a riot, there wouldn't have been an arrest. So we can say, from a fundamental global perspective, it was a dishonest arrest of Chauvin, I mean. No, the arrest of Floyd was quite legitimate, but the arrest of the arresting officers was based on the riot, which was based on false accusations of racism. And without that, there's no arrest. There's an internal review. So I wanted to look at Australian perspective and just imagine a scenario where George Floyd was Australian. Now, he would probably have to be Aboriginal, and because we don't really have the same sort of racial diversity as they have in America, we still have some diversity, but it's different. So let's imagine the arresting officer was white Australian, like Chauvin, and was married to, well, probably wouldn't be a Latina, but let's say, I don't know, a Vietnamese woman. And then we can have one of the arresting officers can be Chinese. We have quite a lot of Chinese in Australia. We can have another one be Aboriginal and another one be Indian. Quite a lot of Indians in Australia. We have quite a lot of Chinese, Indians, Vietnamese. They're three of the main groups. Could have even had an Italian in there, but I'm not going to make it Italian. There's quite a lot of Italians and Greeks in Australia too. We have different racial diversity in Australia. So let's imagine it, and let's imagine George Floyd is Aboriginal. Now let's imagine, instead of him being high on fentanyl, that he's been sniffing petrol, and he's got fumes in him so much that he could die any moment, as was the case with Floyd. Let's imagine he's got the same criminal record, same sort of age, so in his 30s. Probably we don't have gun-related crimes quite as much in Australia, so let's say that his previous things were more knife-related than gun-related, but let's say roughly the same sort of scenario. Counterfeit $20 bills doesn't really happen, but let's say he was caught stealing something, whatever. Has a long history of violent crime, all that sort of stuff. Everything else we're going to say is roughly the same. Minnesota's not really known for its black population, so let's make this somewhere that's not really known for its Aboriginal population. Let's make it Tasmania. So this is going to be in Tasmania. We're going to have this in Hobart, and let's make everything else roughly the same or the equivalent. What would happen? So first of all, Tasmanians, they tend to be about 50 years behind what the rest of Australia are, but let's just assume some Tasmanians have taken videos of it. The people who are Aboriginal in Tasmania, there's not very many of them, that they would have taken a video of it and said how racist it was and so forth. He said he couldn't breathe and then he died and so forth. Of course, we don't really have that knee to neck hold at all in Australia, but there are people, the police officers will just shoot them in the head. So let's just assume that he was just shot in the head or something. But look, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to still have the knee to the neck hold because it makes it easier. So what's going to happen? First of all, there'd be media outcry, there'd be lots of all that. We probably wouldn't have had riots because we don't really have that in Australia, but for the sake of argument, we're having riots. We don't really do that, but let's say that we did. Let's say for this one time we did. Okay, we got international attention. This poor fellow has got international attention. He's died. People have wanted to build statues of him. They're paintings. They're saying that he's a hero, martyr, all this sort of stuff. So, what's happening? Police are saying, get stuffed. We don't care about your rights. We obey the law. We're doing an internal review. You guys are not allowed in. So that's what would happen in Australia. That is what has happened in Australia. So they're doing an internal review. What would the internal review have found? So the first thing to note is that they would go, okay, is this one officer going rogue or is this the entire group of four? And I think that they would find that all four acted similarly. They acted in coordination. It's not like one ran off and did this. And it wasn't on a patrol. This happened after they were called. So it wasn't like they were on a patrol and just randomly came across a black man. That's what the media pretended it was about. The media pretended it was they were on a patrol and randomly came across a black man and then decided to murder him. That's not the case at all. They were called in. So they're called in, all acted together. So the initial stage of the investigation would find that whatever they've done right or wrong, it was done as a group. There was no intimidation from Chauvin. There was nothing to suggest that he's separate from the other three. The only thing is that the video has his knee on their neck, but that doesn't prove that he's separate from the others. And then they're going to look at if there were any errors. And I'd say there were. I've suggested 3 errors. So the first error was that the knee to the neck hold was used. Now that's usually only used for extremely violent offenders when they're not only violent offending but violent resisting arrest and nothing else is working. So they've got that there to force them into a prone position. It's meant to be temporary while they put handcuffs on. Now he already had handcuffs on and it was for 10 minutes. So firstly, since he's already got handcuffs on, that wasn't needed. So that was a mistake. Secondly, it's only meant to be for a minute or two, maybe 3 minutes tops. He had it for about 8 or 9 minutes. Some people have even said 10. That's well and truly above how long you need to have it on, because you only need to have it on briefly to put the handcuffs on. So there's 2 errors there. The third error is George Floyd said, I can't breathe, and this was ignored. Now, I'll note that when people are being arrested, they will often lie in different ways to say, oh, there's something wrong, I'm having a heart attack or whatever, in order to not be arrested and then run away. There's been numerous cases of that. And I think, considering it was a crime of deception, that being counterfeit fraud, there was reason to believe that that was a deceptive thing. However, with 3 other officers around, because he wasn't by himself, that could have mitigated it. He could have had the 3 around him while he lifted him up and then checked. So that didn't happen, so that's a third thing. And I'd actually argue that one was the worst of the 3. So decision to use the knee on the neck hold when he was handcuffed, that's the first error. Second error was doing it for far too long. And the third error was ignoring the breathing thing. So, or ignoring the I can't breathe. So these errors are all errors. Now, obviously what should have happened is no neck hold to start with, no knee to the neck hold. That should not have happened, considering he was already in handcuffs. If that did happen, it should have been very brief, just to withstand him, and that was far too long. And also, having that should not have held it for too long. And the court was agreeing with these three things. These are the three errors. Now, was there anything intent? So that was suggested in trial, but there was never really much merit to it. I mean, they didn't know each other. There was no, I mean, we've established it wasn't just a random patrol that happened upon a black person who decided to murder a black person. And there was no, it wasn't like there were 4 white people. Here in Australia, we have had cases where there were 4 white officers who kill an Aboriginal man and it's still not considered to be racism. So, it's farcical to suggest this had a racist motive. This was definitely not murder. So it's inappropriate to even charge him with murder. And the judge should have thrown that out. But if we're in Australia, we're doing an internal review first. The only way to get to a judicial review is if the internal review recommends it. So at the internal review stage, in America, they don't require an internal review first. They can have an internal review, and they would have had an internal review had there been no video, had there been no outcry. But they're allowed to just skip straight to it. They're not allowed to in Australia. So in Australia, we would have had this internal review, which never happened in America. So I've got to suggest what it might have looked like. So you would have had senior police, senior investigators looking at this according to the law and the code of conduct, what police should have done. And I think they would have found those 3 errors did occur, and that they occurred by all 4 officers equally. Now, there might have been some decision that Chauvin, as the person with the knee to the neck, was more responsible, but I think there's also an argument that he was less responsible because, as he's the one in the action, he's not as aware of such things as the suspect saying he can't breathe. He's in the moment. So I'd argue for some aspects of that, the other 3 are more responsible. And I think overall you'd have to say it's roughly even between the 4 of them. So I can't imagine a scenario where one gets a bigger penalty than the others. It's not really likely to happen. It'd be very close to the same. So what's likely to be a conclusion of it? Well, the first one, you should not be using that hold under those circumstances. He's already got handcuffs on. Just leave him with handcuffs on. He's not going to go very far with handcuffs on. You've got 4 people around. Just shove him in the car. So that's the first thing. You would have had a bit of retraining, and you would have said, well, let's suspend you from active duties while you do that retraining. So I won't put a date on it because we're going to look at all 3. But we're probably thinking about a month to do that training, or we might have a month plus the training. Now, so that's probably going to be from the first one. From the second one, you're going to say, all right, well, you held him for far too long. It's only meant to be for 2 or 3 minutes while you put the handcuffs on. Already had handcuffs on and you held him down for 8, 9, maybe even 10 minutes, depending on which version you accept. That's way too long. And he had handcuffs on anyway. That's a much more severe issue. So we're going to say, all right, that's going to be a similar thing. You're going to need a lot more training. So we're going to give you another 3 or 4 months training. And again, you're going to be suspended for a couple of months before that happens. So we're looking at a couple of months suspension plus maybe 6 months of training. And even though you're paid while you're training, you're not in active duty. So that's 8 months out without active duty. And then the third one is that he ignored the pleas. Now, yes, you are allowed to assume that the suspects are lying. That's reasonable, and I think under the circumstances it was reasonable to suspect that. I think George Floyd had a pattern of dishonesty. He was being arrested for a dishonesty crime. So, a crime of dishonesty. So that was reasonable, but under the circumstances they could have at least checked. Now, they didn't know that he was high on fentanyl. They didn't know that he had a heart attack or had a heart condition. They didn't know he was positive for COVID-19. And they didn't know that he was on methamphetamines. They didn't know all these different things. But you never know what the health condition is of someone. You didn't know that he was in such physically bad shape that he could have potentially died even without the knee to the neck. They didn't know that. Now, in court, the jury agreed that the knee to the neck did well, they actually said that did cause the death. But obviously, that's just the opinion of random people. That's not an expert opinion. And if we'd had an internal review beforehand, they might not have come to that same conclusion. And I think most likely they would have said, well, he died due to a combination of all those things. And he might have died anyway, but probably that at least contributed to it. But at the same time, you should still take a cautionary approach. So instead of this being murder or manslaughter or anything like that, it'd be at most negligence causing death. Now, negligence causing death is still a crime. You can get 5 to 9 years jail for that. But again, you'd have to prove that this was negligence. And I think under the circumstances of him being police officer conducting his duties, in this case arresting someone for a crime, and he definitely committed the crime, then we have to say, okay, it may not have been quite as negligent to be to that standard. Now, I think most likely they would have recommended for the 4 officers to have 6 months suspension, and then following that, at least 6 months training before they're allowed back on active duties. Maybe more than 6 months, maybe 12 months of training. So it could have been 6 months completely off. Now, they'd be paid while they're off, but they'd be sitting at home. Then 12 months of training, supervision and all that. And if they didn't agree to all of those things, then they could be fired. Now, then I think there is a possibility that it could be sent for judicial review only on the refusal to adhere to the pleas of I can't breathe, and only on the possible charge of negligence causing death, a 5 to 9 year sentence. So there is a possibility that they would have been, all 4 of them equally, would have been charged or sent for judicial review. That wouldn't have been a charge. The judicial review would have then had a look at it and gone, well, to get such a conviction, it has to be a severe case of neglect. It has to be such a case that no reasonable person would have even considered it. And I don't really think that's this scenario. Because this is a scenario where you've got someone arrested under a crime of dishonesty, and yeah, they're pleading for that, but they had reason to believe he was lying. Now, yes, it was an error. We're saying it's an error. It's an error, it's an unfortunate error, it's something that they shouldn't have done. And you could potentially have compensation for the victim or the victim's family, financial compensation. That could be an outcome. And they do have such outcomes. $200,000, $500,000, somewhere around that mark. But I don't really think this is the level of definitely losing your jobs as police officers over, nor is it the level of jumping to charging and convictions. Now, also note that the 3 officers besides Chauvin got around 2 to 5 years jail. That's probably a reasonable amount for the upper limit of this. But Chauvin got, by all reports, 25 years or 21 years. It was 10 times that much. Now, as I've said, they should have got the similar charge. But 2 to 5 years jail probably was appropriate for an upper limit for all 4. Now, I'd say that's an extreme view, and probably realistically it wouldn't have happened here in Australia. And had they had the internal review first, it probably wouldn't have gone to judicial review, so we wouldn't have been in court. But let's say somehow that did happen, and by US law they get to skip that. That was within the realms of possibility. We say fair in the sense that it was within the range for 3 of them, but not for Derek Chauvin. So Derek Chauvin's sentence should have been reduced to be what the other 3 got. They should have got the same. And the other 3 didn't get off lightly. They got extremely harsh penalties for what they did. And that should have been the penalty for all four. The only reason we even got to that stage is because of riots, which again were based on false premises, based on the false claim that this was racism when it very clearly wasn't. And riots shouldn't matter. They do in US law, they wouldn't in Australia. So, and they didn't have an internal review, they still haven't had one. And I'm sure they won't have one now. If there'd been an internal review, almost certainly would not have got to the stage of a judicial review. In other words, they would have been suspended, they would have been getting training, all that sort of thing, potentially losing their jobs. That is a hypothetical, but probably unlikely. Even with the videotapes, even with the riots, you still wouldn't. Not in Australia, you wouldn't have. No, you wouldn't. It's a possibility, but probably only losing their job if they were convicted. But under US law, they lost their jobs before they were convicted. So, I think essentially this was a lynching. This was a situation where the laws weren't adhered to by the prosecutor of the police. Laws were adhered to by the police, but then in upholding those laws, the laws were not used in challenging their decision to uphold the laws. Now, agree, fair enough, they upheld the laws sloppily, they made errors, they did it in the wrong way, but they were still upholding the law. And what happens to a society when police officers upholding the law go to jail completely unfairly and for absurd lengths of time because of protests? How can you enforce the law? And you become a lawless society. This is why I'm happy we're here in Australia where that doesn't happen. Now, that's not to say that police officers can't be imprisoned in Australia. They absolutely can. And there are cases where police officers do go to jail in Australia, and that's for such things as where they're dealing drugs. You know, they've confiscated drugs and then deal them. They can go to jail for that, even if they're a police officer when they deal them, because that's not in the course of their duty. Or they just go around and just murder other police officers. That's happened. They go to jail for that, as they should. But if it's in the course of them exercising their duties, even if it's a bit sloppily done, and this was definitely sloppily done, it shouldn't lead straight to this. And it doesn't here in Australia. It might lead to a financial compensation if they found the errors were significant, as they may well have done in this case. You could be getting 200,000, 500,000, but you're not going to jail. And you also wouldn't be having one person go to jail for longer than the others just because the video that was out of context only showed one officer and didn't show the others, and pretended that officer was racist because he was white. So the conviction was, in a sense, a racist conviction, based on false pretexts and based on a whole lot of lies. Again, I'm reliably informed that that's perfectly fine in America, but it's not fine in Australia. It's not how we do things. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye now.